So this morning I got a great question from a friend. Do you think viruses are conscious? And it's really a good question because it helps us kind of focus on what we mean by the word conscious. But what it did for me is it led me down this path of epistemology, which is really what these videos have been about, the last couple at least. And that is just a fancy word in philosophy for how do we know what we know? So it's a theory of knowledge and thinking, and what are we capable of thinking and knowing? And so that's what I've been talking about. Not in the grand scheme of things, but more what can the thinking mind know? So what's the epistemology of the thinking mind? And psychology has studied the thinking mind, although they don't call it the thinking. They think that's all we are. And they've done a great job looking at the limitations of the thinking mind. And but again, psychology has traditionally made the mistake of confusing the thinking mind with consciousness. And so sometimes I use the word consciousness here, and that's because I'm talking about psychology's version of it. And so psychology will say, well, you can only, and this is one of the things they've come to this conclusion, you can only become conscious of one thing at a time. Well, that's not really a limitation of consciousness. It is a limitation of the thinking mind. And consider something simple as memory, and this is another classic in psychology from George Miller. You may have heard we can only hold 7, give or take 2 items in short-term memory. But the interesting thing even about short-term memory is when we're thinking, we can still only think one of those items at a time. So the classic, if you're trying to remember a phone number, 8675309, and you can hold that whole thing, 8675, you can hold it in memory, but even as you're thinking about it, you're still only going through, it's like a little window, and it's passing across each of those numbers one at a time. So psychology absolutely gets it right that we can only hold one thing at a time, but it's not in consciousness. We can hold one thing at a time in the thinking mind. And a great illustration of this, and I'll put the link in the description. Most of my psych students, they've already seen this video, so I don't really, I just talk about it in class because, and you probably have seen it too if you're watching these videos. And the video is, and it comes out with clear instructions. There are some of the people on the screen wearing white t-shirts, some are wearing black t-shirts. And they're passing a basketball around, and your task is to pay attention only to the times that someone with a white t-shirt passes the ball back and forth. So that's that spotlight. Pay attention to a little bit and ignore the rest. And anyway, if you haven't seen it before, I won't give it away. But it does show pretty clearly the limitations of the thinking mind and how much we can think about at one time. Now, the reason this became confusing even in psychology is because of something called, and I've talked about this a lot in my videos, the cocktail party effect. This is when you are thinking of one thing at a time, maybe a conversation with the person, and then someone says something from the back of the room, but it's important to you, like your name or something, and suddenly you notice it. So that's an interesting question. Well, how did you notice it if you weren't paying attention to it in the first place? Well, for psychology, this is kind of a mystery. All they can do is say, well, you must have unconsciously processed it. And then that, if it's important to you, then it gets sent up to consciousness. And of course, that's not the way I'm viewing this whole epistemology. The way I would ask you to consider, at least as possible, is what if you are conscious of everything all at once? So if you remember the Kung Fu series, when Master Po asked the question, can you hear the grasshopper at your feet? That's because they were good at focusing in on the totality of consciousness outside of the limitations of the thinking mind. So when we get possessed, and again, the thinking mind is a great tool, but when you get possessed by it, when that's all you identify with, then you are limited to that tiny little box of thinking, which has a tiny spotlight, which can focus on one thing at a time. So that is really what gets to our question here. The limitation of the thinking mind. Well, how much can it know? Well, it can know one thought at a time, which is like virtually nothing in terms of reality. And maybe that's why Socrates, so we typically think of Socrates as being wise because he recognized that he knew nothing. Maybe if we put a little spin on this, well, maybe what Socrates was getting at, not that he knew nothing, but maybe that he could not know anything, that knowledge was beyond the limitations of the thinking mind. And so when we take this back to this question and we say, well, is a virus conscious? And if we answer that coming from the perspective of the thinking mind, we're gonna be like we're in a huge forest, and that's reality. And we have our tiny little spotlight, and we're focusing maybe on one leaf, and how can we possibly understand the forest when we're focused on this tiny little part of it? When the reality is multiplicity and complexity and billion-way interactions of billions of variables. So we can't. Until we really, I guess to put it in a style of kung fu, the only way we can really get to this question, is a virus conscious, is to first hear the grasshopper at our feet.